In the desolate Nevada desert, Walter Whiskey J. Jennings, an 82-year-old Vietnam War signal specialist, broadcasts nightly on his hand-built AM radio, a ritual born from loss and duty. Half a world away, Echo 6, a special ops team, is stranded in Afghanistan, their comms severed by a cyber attack. Walt's faint signal on 760 kHz becomes their only lifeline. As he relays their desperate call for help, the Pentagon scrambles, stunned by this ghost frequency. Is Walt a relic or a savior? The answer lies in the static, where one man's voice battles the silence to save lives. If Walt's story touched you, join us in honoring quiet heroes. Like, subscribe, and share this tale of Whiskey J's unwavering signal. Comment below about someone in your life who persists without applause. Support our channel to keep these powerful stories alive. Never turn off the signal. In the vast, empty stretches of the Nevada desert, where the horizon swallowed the sun each evening, a faint hum from a radio pierced the stillness. Tucked away in a ramshackle hut, cobbled together from weathered wood and tangled wires, an elderly man sat hunched over a cluttered desk. Walt Jennings, 82 years old, his hands trembling slightly with age but steady with purpose, twisted the frequency dial with the care of a surgeon. A voice crackled through the static, urgent and strained. Echo 6 position compromised. Need evac. Anyone copy? Walt's heart quickened, a familiar jolt of adrenaline surging through his frail frame. He pressed the microphone close to his lips, his voice gravelly but firm. This is Whiskey J. I hear you. The radio hissed in response, a sharp pop erupting from the panel as a spark flared briefly, casting a fleeting glow across his weathered face. The power flickered, threatening to plunge the shack into darkness. But Walt didn't flinch. His eyes, clouded with years but sharp with resolve, stayed fixed on the equipment. With a practiced motion, he reached beneath the desk, his fingers finding the switch for the backup generator. He flipped it, and the low rumble of the machine stirred the silence. Let's see if this old ghost can still holler, he muttered, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Outside, the signal pulsed into the night, a solitary voice cutting through the desert's inky blackness. Somewhere, someone was listening. They called him a relic, a whisper carried on the wind, or simply the old man in the shack. To the scattered residents of Carson Ridge, the nearest town a mile down a cracked, dusty road, Walt was a curiosity, a figure from a bygone era. His home stood alone at the desert's edge, far from the hum of modern life. He had no cell phone, no television, no internet to tether him to the world beyond. His mailbox, an old ammo can bolted to a sagging fence post, hadn't been touched in years, its surface pitted with rust from winters long past. Walt didn't care for the trappings of the present. What he cherished, what kept him tethered to life, was his radio. Each night as the desert sky faded from fiery orange to a cool, dusky blue, and the distant yips of coyotes filled the air, he powered up his hand-built transmitter. The device was a patchwork of salvaged parts, collected over 4 decades, its vacuum tubes glowing faintly as they hummed to life. The antenna outside creaked in the wind, and the red on-air bulb above his desk flickered like a heartbeat. Walt would clear his throat, the sound rough but deliberate, and lean toward the microphone. This is Whiskey J, broadcasting from the silence, he'd say, his words steady, carrying the weight of 29 years of unbroken ritual. Then came the quiet, the warm enveloping hiss of AM static, a sound that felt to Walt like the desert itself breathing. No music followed, no advertisements, just his voice and that hum, radiating across the empty expanse like a pulse beneath the sand. The frequency was 760 kHz, a low-band AM signal that only an old car stereo might catch if the sky was clear and the earth was still. In Carson Ridge, Walt was a local legend, though not always a flattering one. At the diner where the coffee was strong and the gossip stronger, he was the butt of a tired joke. Still out there talking to the ghosts, the regulars would chuckle, shaking their heads. Man thinks he's calling the moon. The younger folks, raised on streaming apps and smartphones, barely knew what AM radio was, let alone why anyone would bother with it. To them, Spotify had replaced the airwaves, and podcasts had sealed their tomb. But Walt didn't broadcast for them. He didn't broadcast for anyone, not really. This wasn't about fame or nostalgia. It was a ritual, a compulsion etched so deeply into his soul that it needed no justification, only devotion. Every night he sat at his desk, the world outside fading away, and he listened. He waited. He kept the line open. Long ago, Walt had been a signal specialist in the U.S. Army, serving during the Vietnam War. He wasn't the kind of soldier who carried a rifle or stormed enemy lines, but the kind who could coax a dead transmitter back to life under a hail of gunfire. With nothing but aluminum foil and a paperclip, he could boost a signal through the densest jungle static. In places like Kang Tree and Pleiku, he ran communications for forward operating bases, his hands steady as he tuned dials and patched wires. To Walt, radio static wasn't noise, it was a language, a map of whispers and cries he alone could navigate. His job was to hear what others couldn't, to catch the faintest plea through walls of interference and ensure help reached those who needed it. The voices that came through his headset stayed with him, some frantic, begging for rescue, some calm, resigned to their fate, some cut off mid-sentence, swallowed by silence. When the war ended, Walt returned home, carrying those voices in his chest like shrapnel. He took a bomb in telecommunications, married a kind woman named Ruth, and raised a son, Daniel. But the urge to listen, to keep the line open, never left him. Ruth had understood, even encouraged his late-night tinkering in their garage. After she passed, and after Daniel moved away to start his own life, Walt retreated to the desert. There he built his shack, his sanctuary, and every night since, Whiskey J had taken to the air. Walt's thoughts often wandered as he sat by the radio, the static filling the gaps in his memory. He thought of Ruth's laugh, soft and warm, and the way Daniel used to sit cross-legged on the floor, watching his father solder wires. He thought of the soldiers whose voices he'd heard in Vietnam, their fates unknown, but never forgotten. Sometimes he wondered if anyone out there still listened, if his signal reached some lonely driver on a desert highway, or a curious kid with an old radio scavenged from a garage. He didn't need to know. The act of broadcasting was enough, a defiance of the silence that threatened to swallow him whole. Tonight, though, was different. The voice that had come through, Echo 6 position, compromised, had stirred something in him, a memory of urgency, of lives hanging in the balance. Walt's hands moved faster now, adjusting the dial, checking the generator's hum. His eyes burned with focus, his heart pounding with the old, familiar thrill of being needed. Somewhere out there, someone was calling, and Whiskey J was answering. In the vast, unyielding quiet of the desert night, Walt Jennings sat before his microphone, his voice a steady beacon cutting through the stillness. He didn't speak for fame or fortune, nor for the fleeting thrill of an audience's applause. He spoke because the world kept turning, its pulse faint but undeniable, and he refused to let that rhythm fade into silence. One day, he believed, someone out there might hear him. Someone loved, someone shown, and when that moment came, Walt would be ready, his signal strong, his voice unwavering, a tether to hope in the endless dark. Walt Jennings had never shouldered a rifle in the heat of battle, but his hands had saved lives, countless souls pulled from the jaws of chaos with nothing more than a microphone, a tangle of copper wire, and a calm, unshakable focus. During the Vietnam War, he served as a signal communications specialist, a role that thrust him into the heart of the conflict without ever stepping onto the front lines. His mission was to erect and maintain radio systems for units scattered across hostile terrain, often cut off from the world by dense jungle and enemy fire. While others carved trenches through the earth or stalked through patrols under the weight of rifles, Walt wrestled with the invisible, static that swallowed voices, transmitters that sputtered and died, field gear battered by the relentless humidity and chaos of war. He didn't need to see the battlefield to know its weight. The front lines came to him in fragments, faint bursts of garbled transmissions, call signs half lost in the crackle, the staccato rhythm of Morse code clawing its way through the jungle's din. Each signal was a lifeline, a thread connecting men to safety, and Walt worked tirelessly to keep those threads intact. Behind the scenes, he rerouted signals through the ether, patched broken relays with deft fingers, and guided medevac helicopters through skies thick with clouds and gunfire. His reputation grew quietly but firmly. "If you're lost out there, call Whiskey J," his commanding officer once said, his voice heavy with trust. He'll find you. Whiskey J wasn't just a call sign, it was a promise, a vow that no one would be left behind in the dark. The voices that reached Walt through the static stayed with him, each one etching itself into his soul. Some were frantic, laced with panic as men pleaded for rescue. Others were faint, whispered through the haze of pain or blood loss. And then there were those that carried an eerie calm, the kind that only came when hope had slipped away, leaving only acceptance in its wake. Walt carried them all. He kept a small black notebook tucked in his rucksack, its pages filled with meticulous records, unit numbers, coordinates, timestamps. Beside some entries, he drew stars, small, proud marks for the lives he'd helped save. Others he underlined in heavy, deliberate strokes, the names of those who'd slipped away before help could reach them. Each mark was a weight, a memory he bore in silence. When Walt returned home in 1973, the war followed him, though he tried to leave it behind. He buried the notebook in a drawer, its pages untouched, its stories unspoken. He didn't share them with his wife, Margaret, whose gentle presence had always been his anchor, nor with his son, Eddie, whose bright eyes and boundless curiosity filled Walt with a quiet pride. Eddie was everything Walt had dreamed a son could be, kind, sharp, and fiercely determined. When Eddie chose to follow in his father's footsteps and enlist, Walt felt a swell of pride tinged with unease. Eddie didn't choose the relative safety of radio work. He wanted the infantry, to stand where the action was, where he believed he could make a difference. Walt didn't argue, though his heart ached with the knowledge his son hadn't yet grasped. War didn't end when the guns fell silent. It lingered, a shadow that whispered long after the battlefield was left behind. In '91, Eddie was deployed to the Kuwaiti desert for Operation Desert Storm. He led a patrol convoy through the endless sands, his voice steady as he guided his men. But war is merciless, and a roadside IED tore through the lead vehicle, stealing Eddie's life in an instant. 2 days later, the knock came at Walt's door. The officer who stood there was young, his words rehearsed, his hands clutching a folded flag that felt heavier than the world itself. Walt accepted it with a nod, his face a mask of stoicism. But inside, grief roared like static, drowning out everything else. Margaret, his rock, crumbled under the loss. Within a year, a stroke claimed her, though Walt knew it wasn't just her body that had failed. It was the silence, the unbearable quiet of a home without Eddie's laughter, without Margaret's warmth. The house felt like a tomb, its stillness a cruel echo of all he'd lost. One sleepless night, driven by a need he couldn't name, Walt ventured into the garage. He sifted through boxes of forgotten relics, his fingers brushing against the tools of his past. Transmitter parts, coaxial cables, vacuum tubes, a soldering kit worn but intact. With a purpose he hadn't felt in years, he carried them to the desert behind his modest home. There, under the vast, star-streaked sky, he built an antenna tower. Not as grand as the ones he'd raised in Vietnam, but just as sturdy, just as true. He wired it all from the ground up, shunning the modern lure of digital signals for the raw, honest hum of analog. When it was done, he powered it on, the dials glowing with a warmth that felt like an old friend. He leaned into the microphone and spoke, his voice steady but heavy with memory. "This is Whiskey J, broadcasting from the silence." He didn't expect an answer. That wasn't why he did it. Each night he returned to the mic, sending his voice into the void, not for recognition, but because the act of broadcasting kept him tethered to the world, to the lives he'd touched, to the son he'd lost. In the quiet of the desert, Walt Jennings became Whiskey J once more, a voice in the dark, waiting for someone, anyone to hear. In the vast, desolate stretches of the Nevada desert, where the horizon seemed to swallow sound itself, Whiskey J sat alone in his weathered radio tower. The structure loomed like a sentinel, its dials casting a faint, eerie glow against the inky night. He wasn't broadcasting for fame or an audience. His voice wasn't meant to be heard by crowds. It was a solitary act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the universe's indifference. Each word he spoke into the microphone was a reminder, to himself, to the stars, that he was still here, still fighting, still refusing to fade into oblivion. The hum of his radio equipment filled the silence, a steady pulse that tethered him to purpose. As long as the tower stood, As long as the dials flickered with life, Whiskey J would keep broadcasting. His voice threading through the dry Nevada air was like a lifeline. Half a world away, in the jagged, unforgiving mountains straddling the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, 6 American soldiers of Echo 6, a covert special operations team, were running out of time. Their mission had been clear: a 72-hour surveillance op to gather intel on a suspected weapons transfer involving local militants. It was supposed to be clean: slip in, observe, slip out. No firefights, no complications. But the second night shattered that plan. Just after midnight, the hillside where they'd set up camp erupted in chaos. Tracer rounds tore through the darkness, stitching fiery trails across the sky. The team scrambled, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging as they grabbed gear and dove for cover. By dawn, the situation was dire. 2 soldiers were wounded, their pained groans cutting through the tense silence. Blood soaked into the rocky ground as the team retreated into a narrow ravine, its steep walls offering scant protection. Their radio, their only link to command, crackled uselessly. The field transmitter showed a connection, but no one answered. Dead air hung heavy, a chilling omen that something far worse was unfolding. In Washington, D.C., deep within the Pentagon's secure underground wing, tension gripped the air. Screens flashed angry red alerts, each one a stab at the room's fragile calm. A communications blackout was spreading like wildfire across military networks. At first, analysts pinned it on localized jamming, standard enemy tactics, but as minutes ticked by, dread settled in. This was no ordinary interference. A coordinated cyber attack was dismantling their systems with surgical precision. Secure channels fell one by one, satellite communications went offline, UHF became a wall of static, VHF scrambled beyond recognition. Even backup satellites, designed to withstand chaos, refused to respond. Layers of encryption, painstakingly built to protect their operations, were stripped away, rerouted, or blocked entirely. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a deliberate strike on the very infrastructure of command. High-level meetings convened in a flurry of clipped orders and grim faces. Emergency protocols were dusted off, playbooks opened. But without a working channel to field teams like Echo 6, every commander in the room felt the same gut-wrenching truth. They were blind. Echo 6 was out there, alive, perhaps trapped, certainly in danger, but unreachable, their fate a question mark in the fog of war. In the ravine, the soldiers of Echo 6 clung to dwindling hope. The team leader, Captain Reese, crouched beside his wounded men, his jaw tight with frustration. He'd trained for this, prepared for every contingency, but this was different. The silence on the radio felt like betrayal. His men looked to him, their eyes searching for answers he didn't have. Private Torres, the youngest, gripped his rifle, his knuckles white, his mind racing with fear of never seeing home again. Sergeant Malone, patching up a bleeding wound on his leg, bit back pain and whispered a prayer, not for himself but for his daughter's birthday he might miss. Each soldier wrestled with their own quiet terror, their thoughts a tangle of duty, survival, and the gnawing question of whether help would come. Back in the Pentagon, desperation clawed at the edges of the Situation Room. Hours into the crisis, voices grew sharp, tempers frayed. Lieutenant Avery Knox, a young officer in the Signals Recovery Unit, sat at a side console, his brow furrowed. He was used to being overlooked, his suggestions often dismissed by senior officers. But something stirred in him now, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. His fingers danced across a keyboard as he pulled up a relic from a bygone era. A low-band redundancy map, a Cold War contingency plan listing ground-based analog radio frequencies. It was a long shot, a dusty artifact from a time before digital ruled the world. Most of the stations on the list were decommissioned, their towers abandoned or never built. Some existed only in theory, half-forgotten plans from paranoid decades. But Knox, driven by a mix of instinct and desperation, ran a sweep anyway. He tuned an ancient receiver, its dials creaking with age, and listened. For nearly 15 minutes, there was nothing but static, a hiss that seemed to mock his efforts. Then, faint but unmistakable, a signal broke through on AM 760. A slow, steady tone followed by a voice, weathered but resolute. "This is Whiskey J, broadcasting from the silence." Knox's heart skipped. He adjusted the gain, feeding the signal through an audio stabilizer. The voice grew clearer, its cadence steady, almost defiant. Broadcasting low and clear, grid stable. This is Whiskey J. Knox's hands trembled as he cross-referenced the frequency in the database. There it was, buried in a footnote, an unlicensed AM signal, logged years ago tied to a lone operator in Nevada. Whiskey J, a name that meant nothing to most, but to Knox it was a lifeline. He didn't know who Whiskey J was or why he was still broadcasting on a forgotten frequency, but in that moment none of it mattered. The signal was real. It was alive, and it might be the only chance to reach Echo 6. In the Nevada desert, Whiskey J leaned back in his creaking chair, unaware of the chaos unfolding across the globe. His voice, rough from years of solitude, carried a quiet strength. He spoke to no one and everyone, his words a ritual to keep the darkness at bay. He thought of the years he'd spent in that tower, the dreams he'd buried, the people he'd lost. Broadcasting was his way of proving he hadn't given up, that he could still make a mark, however small. Little did he know that his signal, faint and flickering, was about to bridge a gap between a stranded team and a desperate command, a thread of hope in a world gone silent. In the vast, desolate expanse of the Nevada desert, where the horizon stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed to swallow sound itself, a faint signal flickered through the airwaves. It came in sporadic bursts, elusive and fragmented, like whispers from a forgotten time. To most, it was nothing more than a curiosity, a ghost in the static, dismissed as the work of some eccentric civilian tinkering with outdated radios. In the tight-knit world of communication hobbyists, it had become a legend, a tale swapped over crackling headsets in dim-lit forums. The myth of Whiskey J, a nameless voice haunting the frequencies. No one knew who he was, where he was, or if he even existed. Yet for Knox, a seasoned operator with a weathered face and a mind sharpened by years of listening to the invisible currents of the air, this signal was more than a story. It was a puzzle, a challenge, a pulse that stirred something deep in his gut. Knox sat hunched in his cluttered station, surrounded by blinking monitors and tangles of wires. His eyes narrowed as he tuned his receiver with a precision born of obsession. The signal wasn't random noise. It had structure, intent. He could feel it, like a rhythm only he could hear. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the dial, coaxing the faint hum into clarity. This wasn't just some ham operator playing Cold War games, broadcasting nostalgia from a garage. The waveform was too precise, its modulation mirroring military patterns from decades past, patterns Knox had studied until they were etched into his memory. He leaned back in his creaking chair, his heart thudding with a mix of excitement and dread. This was real. It had to be. Ignoring the skepticism of his peers, he flagged the signal to his superiors at command, his voice steady but urgent as he relayed his findings. At first, the officers brushed him off, their faces creased with amusement or irritation. A ghost frequency, they called it, probably some prankster with too much time and a knack for mimicry. But Knox wasn't deterred. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they shifted in their seats. But he pressed on, his voice firm, his conviction unshakable. He presented the second piece of evidence, the signal's structure. It wasn't idle chatter or random bursts. The intervals were exact, deliberate, matching the cadence of legacy military transmissions down to the millisecond. One commander, a grizzled man with silver hair and a permanent scowl, leaned forward, his interest piqued despite himself. "You're telling me," he said, his voice low, "that someone's out there broadcasting a military-grade analog signal from right here in the States?" Knox met his gaze, his jaw tight. "Yes, sir," he replied, his words carrying the weight of certainty. "And they're using the only frequency still reaching Echo 6. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. Echo 6, a designation that hadn't been uttered in official channels for years, a relic of missions long buried in classified files. Knox's mind raced, piecing together the implications. This wasn't just a signal, it was a lifeline, a desperate thread connecting them to something or someone lost in time. Without hesitation, he set to work, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he converted Echo 6's last known coordinates and mission data into an analog packet. He formatted it in the legacy alpha cipher, a Vietnam-era encryption he'd only read about in manuals. Its complexity both a comfort and a challenge. 4 times he sent the burst, each transmission a silent prayer into the void. Then he waited, the seconds stretching into eternity, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the speaker. 2 minutes later, the silence shattered. The speaker crackled into life, a voice cutting through the static like a blade. Message received, relay confirmed. I'm on the air. Knox froze, his heart lurching in his chest. He turned slowly, his gaze locking onto the screen, where the signal's waveform danced in jagged peaks. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone answered. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Whiskey J, the myth, the ghost, was no longer a story. He was real, a voice in the wilderness, the only thread left to a stranded soul. Far across the world, in a dusty attic cluttered with relics of a bygone era, Walt Jennings sat alone, his weathered hands clutching a pair of headphones. He was halfway through reading aloud from a 1968 Army survival manual, his voice steady but tinged with the weariness of a man who'd spent decades chasing signals in the dark. The manual was a ritual, a tether to his past, its faded pages a reminder of the soldier he had once been. The hum in his headphones was a constant companion, a drone of static that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. But tonight, something shifted. The hum broke, replaced by a low buzz, faint but insistent, like a pulse buried beneath the noise. Walt's brow furrowed, his instincts flaring. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing the frequency dial with the care of a surgeon, coaxing the signal into focus. Then it came, a voice clipped and garbled, but unmistakably real. Echo 6 requesting evac. Hostiles inbound. Coordinates attached. Any station red, repeat. Dr. Rapam. Any station red. Walt's breath caught, his body going rigid. The signal was weak, likely skipping across the upper atmosphere from some distant corner of the globe. He'd heard plenty of strange broadcasts over the years. Pirate stations, storm chasers, pranksters trying to spook listeners with fake military codes. But this was different. This wasn't chaos. It was deliberate, structured, the voice carrying the clipped precision of a trained soldier. His mind raced, torn between skepticism and a growing sense of urgency. Was this a hoax? A recording looped from some basement? He grabbed a pencil and notepad, his hands shaking slightly as he scribbled the timestamp, the frequency shift, the cadence of the voice. It was American, disciplined, desperate. A soldier in trouble, not playing games. Before he could second-guess himself, the signal surged again, stronger this time, the voice laced with controlled panic. Echo 6 requesting immediate extraction. Coordinates follow. We are surrounded, repeat, surrounded, hostiles inbound from Northwest Ridge. Short-range ammo only. Please advise. Anyone copy? Walt's heart pounded, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. Memories flooded back. Nights in his 20s, crouched under a tarp in the rain, listening to voices like this, calls for help that haunted him still. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his fingers hovering over the mic switch. Doubt gnawed at him, but the voice's urgency cut through it like a knife. This wasn't a drill. This was real. His hand trembled as he pressed the button, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. This is Whiskey J to hear you. Stand by. He released the switch, staring at the equipment as if it might combust. His mind reeled. After all these years, all the nights of dead air and fading signals, someone was out there, calling for help. And not just anyone, Echo 6, a name that hadn't crossed his lips since the days when war was more than a memory. He knew the format, the tone, the weight of the words. This wasn't a prank. It was a cry from the edge of survival, and Walt, Whiskey J, was the only one listening. In the dim, cluttered shack, Walt sat alone, the only soul tethered to a world that had long since faded into silence. No military chatter crackled through the airwaves, no encrypted satellite signals pinged in the distance, just him, a weathered antenna poking through the roof, and the last stubborn system still humming when everything else had crumbled into darkness. His fingers, rough from years of tinkering, hovered over the microphone. He pressed the key, his voice steady, but laced with a tremor of hope he hadn't felt in decades. Echo 6, this is Whiskey J. Relay confirmed. I've got your coordinates. Transmitting acknowledgement now. Keep this frequency clear. Help is on the way. The words hung in the air, heavy with purpose, as the low buzz of the transmitter filled the room, joined by the faint scratch of his pencil scribbling grid markers on a yellowed notepad. His hands moved with a speed that surprised him, driven by instincts buried deep like a soldier snapping to attention after years of civilian life. His breath came even, but his heart thudded with a quiet realization. This was no drill, no cruel prank. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, unspoken, in the marrow of his bones. He wasn't a ghost anymore, haunting a forgotten outpost of wires and dials. He was the last voice on the air, and out there somewhere, someone real was listening, clinging to his signal like a lifeline. Walt's pulse quickened as the weight of that truth settled in his chest, a mix of dread and exhilaration swirling in his gut. He'd spent years in this shack, surrounded by relics of a life spent chasing signals across the globe. His only company, the hum of equipment and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. The solitude had worn him down, made him feel like a shadow of the man who'd once coordinated covert relays under pressure. But now, with Echo 6's faint voice breaking through the static, he felt alive again, every nerve sparking with purpose. He shoved aside a tattered binder stuffed with old broadcast logs, its pages curling from neglect, and swung open the side panel of his main transmitter. Dust billowed into the air, catching the faint glow of a single bulb overhead, and his knees groaned as he dropped to the floor, his joints protesting the sudden movement. His fingers, steady despite the years, reached behind the unit to find the copper gain coil, its surface cool and familiar. He twisted it 2 notches clockwise, bypassing the limiter, a trick he hadn't pulled since the Cold War days when Reagan's voice still echoed through the news. The dial needle lurched into the red, and the transmitter let out a low, strained groan, like an old friend pushed to its limits. "Don't you dare quit on me now," Walt muttered, his voice a mix of command and plea, as if the machine could hear the urgency in his heart. The shack felt alive now, vibrating with the strain of overworked circuits. Walt's mind raced, piecing together the stakes. Whoever Echo 6 was, soldier, survivor, or something else, they were out there, pinned down, their fate hinging on his ability to keep this signal alive. He couldn't let them down. Not now. He scrambled to the cabinet beneath his workbench, yanking it open to reveal a military surplus signal booster from the late 70s. A clunky beast he'd sworn he'd never use unless the world truly went to hell. Well, he thought, his lips twitching with grim amusement, I guess this qualifies. The booster was a relic, its casing scuffed and dented, but it was built to last, a testament to an era when durability trumped flash. He dragged it out, the weight pulling at his shoulders, and set to work. Jumper cables snaked from the base power line to the converter, and he double-checked the grounding with the precision of a man who'd learned the hard way what a single mistake could cost. When he flipped the switch, the shack plunged into darkness for a heart-stopping second, the silence so complete it felt like the world had held its breath. Then the lights flickered back on, brighter, fiercer, and the console roared to life, meters twitching like a pulse quickening. Static poured through the speakers, sharp and clear, a symphony of possibility that made Walt's chest tighten with something like pride. There was no time to savor it. Walt's eyes darted to the shelf where his topographic map of eastern Afghanistan lay folded, its edges frayed from years of handling. He pulled it down with care, as if it were a sacred text, and spread it across the workbench, smoothing it with the edge of his arm. The map was a tapestry of memory, covered in pencil marks tracing old broadcast paths and atmospheric bounce angles, each line a story of a signal sent or received. He hadn't touched it in over a decade, yet his fingers knew exactly where to go, guided by a muscle memory that refused to fade. With a small flashlight clenched between his teeth and a magnifying glass in hand, he hunched over the map, cross-referencing Echo 6's coordinates with elevation data and potential relay paths. His breath came shallow, each exhale a quiet prayer that he'd get this right. The goal was clear: maximize signal clarity, boost the relay power, and hold the line as long as the equipment and his own resolve could stand. Walt's hands moved to the reel-to-reel recorder, a battered machine with a broken eject lever and the faint familiar smell of solder from his old repairs. He'd rigged it years ago to run continuously, a looping broadcast assistant that had saved his sanity during long, lonely nights. He loaded a fresh tape, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of responsibility. He recorded Echo 6's last call, layering it with his own voice. "This is Whiskey J, relaying signal for Echo 6. Coordinates received. Broadcast LVOI. Do not change position." He repeated the message 3 times, each word deliberate, imbued with a quiet intensity, then let the tape roll, a beacon in the dark for whoever was out there. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine them. A soldier crouched in a rocky outpost, a civilian hiding in a war-torn village, their ears pressed to a receiver, clinging to his voice. The thought made his throat tighten, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for sentimentality. Then the heat came, a creeping menace that filled the shack with the acrid scent of straining wires. The old amplifier hissed, a warning of the toll this effort was taking. A spark leapt from a fuse contact, sharp and bright, and the smell of burning insulation hit Walt like a slap. His heart lurched, but he didn't hesitate. He lunged for the breaker panel, his fingers fumbling for the auxiliary heater switch. He killed it with a flick, redirecting every scrap of power to the antenna feed. "We've made it this far," he said, his voice low but fierce, as if daring the equipment to defy him. The console hummed, the signal held, and Walt exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. He was back in the fight, the only one left on the air, and somewhere out there, Echo 6 was counting on him. For the first time in years, Walt felt like he mattered, like his hands, his voice, his stubborn refusal to give up could make a difference. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the glowing dials, and waited for the next transmission, ready to keep the line open as long as it took. Walt Jennings hunched over the battered console in his Nevada shack, the air thick with the acrid scent of scorched wiring. His gnarled fingers, trembling from age and urgency, clutched a pair of pliers as he yanked out a smoking relay. The sting of bare metal against his skin barely registered. "You're not quitting on me before they're safe," he growled at the flickering equipment, his voice a low rasp of defiance. A jolt from the side panel zapped his hand, and he hissed a string of curses, his frustration boiling over. Gritting his teeth, he tore a strip of electrical tape from a roll dangling on the wall and wrapped the frayed wire with fierce precision. Every move was deliberate, driven by a bone-deep resolve that refused to falter. Each broadcast cycle felt like a roll of the dice. Would the signal punch through the static? Would the next surge fry the ancient rig for good? Would these precious seconds be the line between hope and despair for the men out there? Walt didn't know, and in the heat of the moment, he didn't care. All that mattered was the 6 soldiers of Echo 6, stranded in some godforsaken corner of the world, clinging to their position and waiting for a voice to cut through the chaos. He was that voice. His heart thudded with a mix of fear and duty as he pressed the mic, his thumb steady despite the ache in his joints. "Echo 6, this is Whiskey J. Transmissions holding strong. Signal's clear. Keep talking, boys. I'm right here with you." His words were calm, a lifeline thrown across miles of desert and danger. Walt didn't budge from the chair. His body screamed for rest. His back ached. His eyes burned from the dim glow of the dials. But he shoved the pain aside. This wasn't just a broadcast. It was a battle, waged against failing circuits and fading hope. Every voltage spike was an enemy he had to outmaneuver. In his mind, he saw those soldiers, faces he'd never know, waiting for him to keep the line open. He wouldn't let them down. Not tonight, not ever. Meanwhile, at 400 hours Eastern Time, deep within the Pentagon's secure communications wing, a heavy gloom hung over the room. The U.S. military's global network was in shambles, crippled by a vicious cyber attack. VHF, UHF, and satellite links were either scrambled or dead, leaving analysts staring at silent terminals. Lines of error code blinked like flatlined EKGs, mocking their efforts. The weight of failure pressed on every officer, their minds racing with the stakes. Lives hung in the balance, and they were powerless. Then a faint crackle broke the silence. A message flickered across a fallback relay, primitive but unmistakable. Echo 6 position confirmed. Transmission stable. Relay by Whiskey J. The room froze, breath held in collective disbelief. The message looped again, then again, each repetition hammering home its reality. Timestamp verified. Coordinates valid. The signal traced back to an unregistered AM 760 frequency broadcasting from rural Nevada. Colonel Dana Mallister, her face etched with exhaustion and resolve, leaned over the situation table. "Who the hell is Whiskey J?" she demanded, her voice sharp with urgency. Lieutenant Avery Knox, a young signals tech with sweat beading on his brow, raised a tentative hand. "Ma'am, we've been tracking that frequency for the last hour. Whoever's out there, he's been relaying Echo 6's signal in real time. His setup's ancient, but it's rock solid." Mallister's eyes narrowed, her mind churning through possibilities. "Is he military?" she pressed. Knox hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Not officially, ma'am, but I ran the waveform through our archival system. This guy's not just improvising. He's using Vietnam-era Army FieldComm protocols, format codes, relay cadence, all textbook perfect." Mallister stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. "Name," she ordered. Knox's fingers flew across a keyboard, pulling up a database so outdated its grayscale interface looked like a relic. After a tense wait, a file loaded, a grainy photograph, a service record, and a name in bold. Walter Jennings, SFC, retired Signal Corps, 1967 to 1973. The report detailed 12 confirmed field rescue assists via low-band analog, with a humble note from Jennings himself. "The radio did the work. I just listened." The room fell silent, the weight of his legacy sinking in. A gravelly voice cut through the stillness. General Richard Kelton, a grizzled veteran pulled from retirement for crises like this, stepped forward. His eyes, hardened by decades of war, softened as he studied the screen. "I know that call sign," he said quietly, his voice thick with memory. Whiskey J never missed a message, not once. He tapped the photo, his finger lingering as if touching the past. In the 70 offensive in Cambodia, that man routed chopper extractions with nothing but copper wire and sheer will. Every unit trusted him, even when command doubted. Kelton turned to Mallister, his gaze unyielding. "You want Echo 6 home? Give him whatever he needs, and don't mess with that frequency." A few officers exchanged skeptical glances, their unease palpable. "Sir," one ventured, "he's 82, a civilian, using unlicensed gear." Kelton's eyes flashed with a mix of indignation and pride. "And he's outshining half our cutting-edge systems while we're stuck twiddling our thumbs." His words carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many lives saved by grit to doubt Walt now. Walt Jennings sat alone in his cluttered Nevada shack, the faint hum of his ancient radio rig filling the air. The console before him was a patchwork of exposed wires and flickering dials, its scorched smell a constant reminder of its fragility. His weathered hands, marked by years of hard labor, gripped a pair of pliers as he swapped out a smoking relay. The hot metal seared his fingertips, but he barely flinched. "You're not giving up before they're safe," he muttered to the machine, his voice a gritty blend of determination and defiance. A sudden shock from the side panel sent a jolt through his arm, and he cursed under his breath, his frustration a fleeting release. With a quick tear, he grabbed electrical tape from the wall and wrapped the frayed wire, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. Every broadcast was a high-stakes gamble. Would the signal break through the static? Would the next power surge fry his only lifeline to the outside? Would these critical moments mean the difference between survival and silence for the men depending on him? Walt didn't have answers. His heart pounded with a mix of dread and resolve, but he pushed the doubts aside. 6 soldiers, Echo 6, were out there pinned down, waiting for a voice to guide them through the darkness. He was that voice, and the weight of their lives anchored him to the chair. Leaning into the mic, he spoke with a steady calm that masked his inner storm. "Echo 6, this is Whiskey J transmissions holding strong. Signals clear. Keep talking, boys. I'm right here with you." Walt refused to rest. His body ached, his spine protested, his eyes burned. But he ignored it. This wasn't just a broadcast. It was a fight. A war against failing tech and fading hope. Each crackle of static, each voltage spike, was an adversary he met head-on. In his mind, he saw those soldiers, young and resolute, trusting him to keep the line alive. He wouldn't fail them. At 0400 hours Eastern Time, in the Pentagon's Secure Communications Wing, despair hung heavy. A cyber attack had gutted the military's global network, leaving VHF, UHF, and satellite links useless. Analysts slouched over dead terminals, their screens flashing error codes like fading pulses. The room was thick with tension, each officer grappling with the fear of lives lost to their inaction. Then, a faint signal pierced the silence. A message via a fallback relay, raw and analog but clear. Echo 6 position confirmed. Transmission stable. Relay by Whiskey J. The room stilled, hope flickering in their eyes. The message repeated, its timestamp and coordinates verified. The signal traced to an unregistered AM 760 frequency in rural Nevada. Colonel Dana Mallister, her face tight with exhaustion, leaned over the situation table. "Who the hell is Whiskey J?" she snapped, her voice betraying a mix of curiosity and urgency. Lieutenant Avery Knox, a young signals tech, raised a shaky hand. "Ma'am, we've been monitoring that frequency for an hour. He's relaying Echo 6's signal in real time. His gear's old, but it's steady as a rock." Mallister's brow furrowed. "Military?" she asked. Knox paused, his mind racing. "Not officially, but I checked the waveform against our archives. He's using Vietnam-era Army field comm protocols, codes, cadence, all perfect." Mallister stepped closer, her interest sharpening. "Name," she commanded. Knox tapped into a dusty database, its grayscale interface a throwback to another era. A file loaded, a faded photo, a service record, and a name. Walter Jennings, SFC, retired Signal Tour, 1967-1973. 12 field rescues via low-band analog, with a modest note, "The radio did the work. I just listened." Silence fell, the room absorbing the man's quiet heroism. A voice broke the hush. General Richard Kelton, a weathered veteran recalled for this crisis, approached the screen. His eyes, etched with years of war, softened with recognition. "I know that call sign," he said, his voice heavy with nostalgia. Whiskey J never missed a message. He touched the photo, memories flooding back. In Cambodia, 70, he guided chopper extractions with just copper wire and grit. Every unit trusted him, even when brass didn't. Turning to Mallister, he added, "Want Echo 6 home? Give him what he needs. Leave that frequency alone." Skeptical murmurs stirred. "He's an 82-year-old civilian and with unlicensed equipment," an officer protested. Kelton's gaze hardened. "And he's outdoing our billion-dollar systems while we're sitting here useless." His words silenced the room, carrying the conviction of a man who knew Walt's worth. In the dim glow of a cluttered command center, the air buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. A team of special operations communicators had locked onto a faint but persistent signal, one they'd almost overlooked. Walter Jennings, a grizzled old radio operator once written off as a relic, had become the linchpin of a desperate mission. His broadcast, a lifeline for a stranded team, was now under constant surveillance. Engineers scrambled to mirror his analog signal digitally, ensuring not a single pulse would be lost. The CIA, usually skeptical, had thrown in satellite support to pinpoint the coordinates Walt relayed, but even they admitted their tech was useless without his steady feed. In less than an hour, Walt had gone from a forgotten voice in the static to the heartbeat of a critical operation. Major Kelton stood at the edge of the command table, his eyes fixed on a blinking green light that pulsed with each cycle of Walt's signal. A faint smile tugged at his lips, a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Still out there, huh, Walt?" he muttered under his breath, his voice thick with respect for the old man's stubborn grit. "You tough old bastard." The room hummed with focus now, a quiet hope flickering to life at precisely 7:60 a.m. Walt, the man they'd all but erased from their plans, hadn't forgotten how to listen when it mattered most. In a cramped shack thousands of miles away, the clock on the wall read U327. Walt Jennings sat hunched over his transmitter, his weathered face bathed in the soft red glow of the equipment. His eyes, bloodshot from hours of unblinking focus, never left the signal meter. Beside him, a clipboard overflowed with meticulous, hand-scrawled logs, timestamps, transmission loops, frequency tweaks. He'd confirmed Echo 6's coordinates, cleaned the data, and retransmitted it dozens of times, each burst a lifeline sent into the ether. Every 90 seconds, he sent a 7-second coded pulse. Terrain adjustments, evacuation markers, coordinates locked in at full power. The shack rattled when a power surge hit, and the backup coil hissed from the strain. But Walt didn't flinch. His hands, steady despite the blisters forming from soldering a replacement capacitor mid-transmission, moved with the precision of a man who'd spent decades mastering his craft. He hadn't eaten in hours, hadn't touched the water bottle at his side, but his voice never wavered. "Echo 6, this is Whiskey J," he said into the mic, his tone calm but firm, carrying the weight of their survival. "Your coordinates are transmitting strong. Hold position. Air assets are en route. You are not alone." His words were more than protocol. They were a promise born from a stubborn refusal to let those men down. Walt's heart pounded with the weight of it, but his focus was unbreakable. He'd keep the line alive, no matter what it took. 6,000 meters away in the jagged barren foothills straddling the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, the men of Echo 6 crouched in a shallow ravine, their breaths shallow and their bodies aching. The air was biting, cold slicing through their soaked boots, the meltwater seeping into their bones. Two of the team were wounded, their bandages soaked with blood and grit. Another lay unconscious, his shallow breathing a constant reminder of how close they were to losing him. They'd been waiting for death, resigned to the silence of the mountains, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. Reese, the team leader, clenched his jaw, his mind racing with guilt and fear. He'd led them into this trap, and now their survival hung on a faint signal from a man they'd never met. The team was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Memories of home, regrets, the weight of their injuries. Then a sound broke through the stillness, a low, distant thump, barely audible at first, growing into a rhythmic pulse that stirred their weary souls. Reese's head snapped up, his heart leaping. He knew that sound, they all did. Rotors. The night sky seemed to crack open as a Black Hawk helicopter roared low over the eastern ridge, flanked by two Apaches, their sleek forms barely visible in blackout formation. Navigation lights dimmed to near invisibility. Dust swirled like a storm as the Black Hawk descended hard into the landing zone they'd marked with smoke and a heat flare just as Whiskey J had instructed. "Let's move," Reese shouted, his voice raw with urgency and relief. The team surged forward, adrenaline overriding their pain. One soldier hoisted the unconscious man over his shoulder. Another limped behind, covering their rear with his weapon raised. The Black Hawk's ramp dropped before it even touched the ground, two crewmen leaping out, waving them forward with practiced urgency. Reese's hands trembled as he grabbed the comms handset from his pack, switching to the backup band they'd kept open since the mission began. In the chaos of wind and engine roar, he pressed the mic to his lips, his voice thick with gratitude. "Whiskey J, if you're out there, we owe you our lives." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. The team piled into the Black Hawk, their movements frantic but coordinated, driven by the instinct to survive. The ramp slammed shut, the doors sealed, and the helicopter lurched upward, banking sharply into the night. Gunfire cracked from the hills behind them, sharp and desperate. But the Apaches responded with a deafening roar of return fire, their precision cutting through the darkness. As the Black Hawk climbed, Reese leaned back, his chest heaving, his mind replaying Walt's steady voice. Somewhere out there, an old man in a shack had refused to give up on them, and because of him, they were going home. In the heart of the Nevada desert, where the wind howled like a restless spirit, Walter Jennings sat in his weathered shack, bathed in the faint glow of a green signal light. The static crackling through his headset was a familiar companion, a constant murmur that had woven itself into the fabric of his life. Decades had passed in this solitary vigil, each night a quiet battle against the silence that threatened to swallow his hope. Yet, on this night, something shifted. Through the haze of static, words pierced the air, clear and triumphant. They were out. Echo 6 was safe. Walt's hands, calloused from years of gripping the microphone, loosened their hold. His shoulders, perpetually hunched from the weight of waiting, sagged in relief. A wave of warmth flooded his chest, a mixture of pride and exhaustion that made his eyes sting. He stared at the blinking green light on his console, its steady pulse a testament to his unwavering faith. For a moment he was still, letting the reality sink in. 6 men were alive. 6 voices had answered his signal. His heart swelled with a quiet joy, tempered by the deep ache of a man who had given everything to a cause few understood. Reaching for the mic one last time, Walt's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of finality. His voice, low and steady, carried a warmth that belied his years of solitude. "You boys don't owe me a thing," he said, each word deliberate, a gift to the men he'd never meet. "Just get home." Releasing the button, he moved slowly, as if savoring the moment. He removed his headset, placing it gently on the desk, its worn leather a map of his dedication. Behind him, the reel-to-reel player spun softly, looping the final message. "Mission received. Echo 6 safe. Transmission standing by." The words were a lullaby, soothing the part of him that had never dared to hope for this day. Walt leaned back in his creaking chair, his gaze drifting to the window. Beyond the glass, the desert stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of sand and shadow. In the distance, the antenna tower loomed, its rusted frame battered by years of relentless wind. To anyone else, it was a relic, a forgotten sentinel in a world that had moved on. To Walt, it was a lifeline held together by memory, faith, and a stubborn refusal to give up. He didn't speak again. There was no need. His job was done. The weight of decades lifted, leaving behind a quiet peace that settled deep in his bones. He thought of his son, Eddie, whose smile still lingered in the worn photograph on the wall. He thought of the soldiers he'd never know, now safe because of a signal he'd kept alive. For the first time in years, Walt felt whole. A week later, a military reporter from Stars and Stripes made the long trek into the desert, drawn by a story that had already spread like wildfire through military circles. The tale of Walt Jennings, the man who saved Echo 6 from a shack in the middle of nowhere, had captured hearts and sparked awe. The reporter, a young man named Thomas Reed, felt a mix of anticipation and reverence as he approached the cabin. He'd heard the stories. Whiskey J, the voice in the dark, the guardian who never faltered. But nothing prepared him for the silence that greeted him. The screen door creaked on its hinges, swaying in the desert breeze. Inside, a low hum filled the air, the transmitter still running, its red light glowing like a heartbeat. The reel-to-reel tape had stopped, frozen mid-loop, as if time itself had paused to honor the man who'd sat there. Walt's headset rested on the desk, tilted slightly, a silent witness to his final moments. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He knew without touching anything that Walt was gone. The old man had passed in the night, seated in the chair where he'd spoken his last words. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of distress, just a man who had finished his work and slipped away, his duty complete. Thomas's eyes stung as he took in the scene. He felt the weight of Walt's life, the years of quiet sacrifice that had culminated in this moment. On the wall, a faded photograph caught his attention. Walt and his son Eddie, both in uniform, standing proud beneath an American flag. The frame was worn, but the smiles were vivid, a snapshot of a happier time. Next to it, a folded note rested atop the operating log, its edges crisp despite the dust. Thomas hesitated, then unfolded it, his hands trembling. The words, written in Walt's steady hand, were simple yet profound. To anyone still listening, never turn off the signal. A lump formed in Thomas's throat. He stood there motionless, letting the words sink in. He didn't touch anything else. He didn't need to. The shack itself was a testament to Walt's legacy, a shrine to a man who had lived for others. That evening, Thomas's article hit the wires and the story of Walt Jennings exploded across the nation. Broadcast networks picked it up, veterans groups shared it, and civilians marveled at the quiet heroism of a man they'd never known. But it was the soldiers who felt it deepest. To them, Walt was more than a story. He was a lifeline, a reminder of the voices that guide you home when all hope seems lost. On military forums, they called him a legend, a guardian, the last signal man. Members of Echo 6, still reeling from their ordeal, gave public statements, their voices thick with gratitude. He was the voice we didn't know we needed. one said, his eyes glistening. The one that never left us. Another, a young sergeant, added, I owe my life to Whiskey J. We all do. Walt's shack became a place of pilgrimage. A week after the story broke, the Army Corps of Engineers arrived, their boots kicking up dust as they worked. They erected a simple metal plaque near the base of the antenna, its words etched with care. This frequency once saved lives. In silence, he spoke the loudest. Walter Jennings, Whiskey J, 1941-2023. They didn't touch the antenna. It stood as it always had, humming softly, a silent promise that some signals never fade. Late at night on frequency 760, some claimed they could still hear it, a faint crackle of static, a whisper if you listen long enough. To them, it was Walt, still watching, still waiting. Walt Jennings had never sought fame. He didn't crave recognition or applause. Night after night, he'd shown up, driven by a belief that someone somewhere might need his voice. In a world that grew louder and faster, Walt's quiet persistence was a rare and precious thing. His story wasn't about radios or signals. It was about duty, about showing up when no one else would, about doing what's right even when the world says it doesn't matter. Walt had been that voice in the dark, steady and true, and his legacy would live on in every soldier who made it home, in every listener who refused to turn off the signal. In the desert, the antenna still stands, a weathered monument to a man who believed in the power of a single voice. And somewhere in the static, Walt's whisper lingers, a reminder that some frequencies never die. They wait, they carry, and they remember.